Part 1, The Crossed Border. There is a photograph from 1925, taken in the dense, suffocating depths of the Brazilian interior, that I keep returning to. It records a moment we were never meant to understand. It captures a man standing at the edge of a clearing he was never supposed to reach, at the boundary of a world that official history has spent a century keeping in the shadows. This man is Lieutenant Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett, a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, a meticulous topographer, and a soldier trained to observe, record, and report exactly what his eyes beheld. He stepped into that forest, and he never came back. In the decade that followed his disappearance, 3 different governments spent massive resources and diplomatic capital making absolutely certain that no one would follow his footsteps. For 8 months, I have been sitting with the primary sources of this mystery. 8 months of cross-referencing colonial logs, dusty expedition diaries, and military records that were not classified, but rather quietly misfiled, placed in drawers and folders where they shouldn't be, yet accessible to anyone with the quiet patience to look. What I found in those records changes how I perceive every map, every boundary, and every historical model I have ever been taught to trust. Fawcett did not just vanish into the green void. He arrived. He located the very coordinates he was searching for, and whatever he stood before in those final, unrecorded days was considered so dangerous to the established geopolitical and academic order that a system of active silence has been strictly maintained for over 100 years. Part 2, The Practical Surveyor. Before we venture further, we must establish one critical fact: Percy Fawcett was not a romantic daydreamer. He was not a seeker of mythical fountains or a victim of jungle fever. Prior to his final journey into the Mato Grosso in the spring of 1925, Fawcett had already completed 7 grueling, highly technical expeditions into the uncharted heart of South America. These were not amateur excursions, they were official, institutionally commissioned boundary surveys, accepted without controversy by the Royal Geographical Society in London. He was a man who mapped rivers that European cartographers believed were myths. He negotiated safe passage with indigenous nations that colonial authorities described, conveniently, as hostile and uncontactable. He was a practical, clinical scientist of the landscape. He did not see things that were not there. So, when Fawcett began writing in his private correspondence, in his field notes, and in letters to trusted colleagues about a lost civilization he simply designated as a Z, we must ask a specific question. Not whether he had lost his mind, but why a highly decorated, empirically trained surveyor became increasingly insistent that the unexplored interior of Brazil held the physical remnants of an ancient civilization of staggering scale and antiquity. He described a city built of stone, meticulously organized, and old in a way that directly challenged the accepted sequence of human development in the Western Hemisphere. He was not guessing. He possessed historical sources, chief among them a document he referred to as Manuscript 512. Held in the archives of the National Library of Rio de Janeiro. This 18th-century Portuguese account, written by a band of Bandeirantes in 1753, detailed the discovery of a massive, ruined stone city in the Bahia interior, complete with monumental archways, multi-story buildings, and mysterious inscriptions carved in an unidentified, ancient script. The document exists. It is catalogued. Anyone can request to see it. What you cannot find, however, is any serious institutional engagement with what it describes. The silence surrounding Manuscript 512 is deafening, and Fawcett knew it. Part 3, The First Voyage. But Fawcett was not the beginning of this story. He was not even close to the first European to witness the truth of the interior. To find the origin of the narrative, we must go back nearly 4 centuries earlier, to the year 1541. A Spanish conquistador named Francisco de Orellana descended from the Andes and became the first European to navigate the full length of the Amazon River, 4.4. Traveling with him was a Dominican friar named Gaspar de Carvajal, who kept a detailed, day-by-day chronicle of the voyage. What Carvajal recorded, consistently and repeatedly across thousands of miles of river, was not an untouched wilderness. It was a thriving, high-density civilization. He described massive, fortified cities stretching along the riverbanks for miles at a time, populated by hundreds of thousands of citizens. He wrote of wide, raised roadways connecting inland settlements, of highly organized agriculture at a scale he struggled to comprehend, and of exquisite pottery and textile works. In one specific passage that modern historians have handled with extreme caution, Carvajal described majestic, white stone towers rising high above the forest canopy, visible from the riverbanks. The standard academic treatment of Carvajal's chronicle for the past several centuries has been to dismiss it as a work of wild exaggeration. We are told he was a friar seeking to impress his superiors in Spain, constructing a fantasy of wealth to justify further colonization. But this explanation raises a critical problem. Why would a man whose spiritual and professional credibility depended on honest witness fabricate easily testable claims? Why invent cities, roads, and towers that any subsequent Spanish or Portuguese expedition could easily disprove upon arrival? And more importantly, if he invented these details, why do the specific features he described, the dark, rich soil, the managed riverbank settlements, the massive road networks, align so precisely with what modern archaeology is only now, with great reluctance, beginning to uncover? Part 4, The Secrets of Marshal Rondon. The systematic omission of these discoveries becomes even more apparent when we examine the career of Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon, a Brazilian military officer, engineer, and the founder of what eventually became FUNAI, the government agency for indigenous affairs. Rondon spent more time in the unexplored interior of Brazil between 1890 and 1930 than perhaps any other trained observer in history. Rondon mapped the territory, surveyed its resources, and laid the physical telegraph lines that connected the distant western borders of Brazil to the coast. In 1913, he co-led a scientific expedition into the interior with former United States President Theodore Roosevelt, a journey immortalized in Roosevelt's book, Through the Brazilian Wilderness. It is a fascinating text, particularly for what it leaves unsaid. Roosevelt notes, briefly and without elaboration, that during their journey, Rondon showed him specific, highly unusual features of the landscape. However, Roosevelt writes that he was unable to include these observations in his published account at Rondon's explicit request. Let that sink in. A former president of the United States, on a joint scientific expedition, explicitly states in his own memoir that a Brazilian military colonel asked him to censor specific landscape observations from the public record. What were those features? We do not know. Roosevelt honored the agreement, and Rondon, in his own extensive published reports, never returned to the subject. The gap remains in plain view, sitting in the public record of one of the most heavily documented expeditions in South American history. As you dig deeper into Rondon's declassified correspondence and military archives, a pattern emerges, not of outright lies, but of careful, deliberate incompleteness. Reports filed to the military are referenced in indexes but are missing from the files. Physical descriptions of unusual earthworks and stone alignments begin, only to abruptly stop. The information was not lost, it was managed. Part 5, The Engine of the Forest. The true nature of what Fawcett, Rondon, and Orellana witnessed began to force its way into the light at the turn of the 21st century. As intensive logging and agricultural clearing stripped away the forest canopy in the Brazilian state of Acre, the earth beneath began to speak. It revealed geoglyphs, massive, geometric earthworks carved directly into the clay of the Amazon basin. Circles, squares, octagons, and complex nested corridors, some spanning up to 300 meters in diameter, laid out with a geometric precision that defies simple, primitive tools. The initial academic response was to classify these structures as ceremonial enclosures, the default archaeological label for any ancient structure whose practical function cannot be easily explained by modern models. We are told they were gathering spaces, the prehistoric equivalent of a village green, used only occasionally for rituals. But this explanation collapses when you look at the physical context of these geoglyphs. They do not sit in isolation. They are consistently located at the boundaries of the densest concentrations of Terra Preta de Indio, the legendary Amazonian black earth. Terra Preta is not a natural soil. It is anthropogenic, meaning it was engineered by human hands. Rich in biochar, organic matter, nutrients, and microscopic pottery fragments, this soil is highly fertile, self-regenerating, and capable of retaining nutrients in a tropical environment where normal soils are stripped bare by rain within a few seasons. Whoever inhabited these geoglyph complexes constructed the very ground beneath their feet. They built a soil system that has survived, active and productive, for over 1,000 years after its creators vanished. Part 6, The Designed Canopy. And then, there are the trees. The distribution of tree species throughout the Amazon basin is not wild, and it is not random. A landmark ecological study published in recent years analyzed the composition of the forest and found a staggering, anomalous concentration of domesticated and semi-domesticated food-producing species precisely in the areas of historical human occupation. Brazil nut, cacao, acai, and peach palm do not grow in these dense, monoculture-like clusters by accident. They are the survivors of an ancient, sophisticated agroforestry system. When you look at the forest through this lens, the entire concept of the Amazon as a primordial wilderness dissolves. It was not a jungle to be feared or conquered. It was an infrastructure. A civilization lived here that operated not by clearing the forest, but by designing it. They engineered the soil, directed the water, and selected the plant species to create a self-sustaining, self-producing biological machine that fed, housed, and organized millions of people. It was a city where the buildings were trees, the roads were canals, and the walls were earthworks. It was built to endure, and it has endured, running its original programming long after the programmers disappeared. Part 7, A Global Blueprint. This realization leads to a deeply unsettling conclusion, because this pattern is not restricted to South America. Once you learn to recognize the signature of an engineered landscape, you see it everywhere. We see it in the great river valleys of sub-Saharan Africa, where archaeologists are uncovering vast, ancient water management networks that dwarf the physical footprint of any known contemporary settlements. We see it in Southeast Asia, where the hydraulic civilization of Anka is now understood to be not an isolated anomaly, but a single visible node in a vast, regional system of landscape design. We even see it in the ancient, primeval forests of Europe and Japan, in Bielo-Isa, in Yakushima, and in Akigahara at the base of Mount Fuji. These forests, celebrated as the last remnants of untouched nature, show clear signs of systematic, ancient modification. And in Europe, during the massive urban transformations of the 1850s through the 1890s, we find a curious, coordinated effort across multiple countries to systematically alter the composition of urban forests. Productive, food-bearing provider trees were systematically removed and replaced with purely ornamental, sterile species. The institutional memory of what those forests had once been, and how they had nourished the populations that lived within them, was quietly archived, while the public was taught to see the new, sterile parks as nature in its purest form. Part 8, The Silence and the Satellites. Why does this matter? Why has such a massive effort been expended, across centuries and continents, to maintain the myth of the wild, untamed wilderness? The answer lies in the foundation of our modern political and economic models. Our systems of property, governance, and historical progress are built on a specific narrative that human history is a linear march from primitive, disorganized gatherers to advanced, technological societies. To admit that the vast, productive forests of the world are not wild jungles, but the abandoned ruins of an older, highly sophisticated biological technology, is to admit that our modern way of interacting with the planet is not the pinnacle of progress, but a step backward. It is to admit that a civilization once existed that could support millions of people without destroying the biosphere, a civilization that built with nature rather than against it. This is the truth that Percy Fawcett was walking toward when he entered the Mato Grosso in 1925. He was not looking for a city of gold, he was looking for a different way of being human on this earth. He went looking for a system that had integrated human society into the living fabric of the planet. In his final letter, written from the edge of the uncharted territory, he told his wife, "The story of the Americas will need to be rewritten." He was right. And the silence that has surrounded his path for a century remains, not because his destination was a fantasy, but because the truth of what he found would dismantle the very foundations of the world we have built in its absence.